All right, so welcome back to the channel, everyone. Today I got a special guest, Libo Lee from Katalyst.di, and you're the CTO over there, right?
Yes, sir. CTO at Katalyst.di, or that's what they call me.
Nice,
Currently, kind of managing both the product and engineering teams over there.
awesome, man. And can you tell us a little bit about just your background? Like, I think you were trained as an architect, right?
Yeah, so architect background, worked in both small and big firms. I think found out very quickly that probably a traditional architecture path wasn't for me. Worked at WeWork, where I was lucky to do a lot of building information management, a lot of design automation, and really kind of make a foray into a lot of data, a lot of code, a lot of automation and things like that, which was, I think, something that really, I guess, was the first step in this direction, kind of where I'm now. So after WeWork, I did some consulting. I worked at a BIM outsourcing company before ultimately landing at Katalyst to lead the technology here.
Nice, man. That's awesome, dude.
Yeah.
And if you could give everyone on the channel a background of like sort of what does Katalyst.di do? What are you all about? Like, what problems are you solving? That sort of thing.
Mhm. So at Katalyst.di, we're all about kind of helping um, the the industry build better. And how we see it is that to really meet the demand that is facing kind of the industry, especially in sectors like data centers, renewable energy, that it really takes this new way of building. And we really believe in kind of this movement in the industry towards industrialized construction. Something that encompasses what you might hear a lot as like prefab, kind of modular, even sort of additive manufacturing. It's all kind of like in this umbrella.
Nice. Can you unpack that a little bit more too? Like, what are some examples of that you're doing there, and maybe like try to put a little more meat on that for people because that's kind of new to me too. So I'm interested.
Mhm. Yeah, so I think um, maybe some folks are familiar, maybe some are not, but you kind of see a growing number of companies talk about things like prefab and modular construction as
Yep.
a way to complete a project much faster, much more efficiently, lower cost, things like that. This kind of logic and this workflow can really be applied across the construction industry, and really where it matters most and where it can have the most impact are these like very capital intensive build programs
Right.
like data centers, where you're building something that's mostly repeatable but may not kind of be organized that way on each of the builds. I don't
Got
know how much you know about construction.
it. Very little. I did get exposed to it when I was younger. I did some consulting work for this company, AJ
Mhm.
Bart, that did like concrete tilt ups and stuff. But that was so long ago, dude. Like I just remember it was really chaotic. There was
Yeah.
always like a ton of change orders coming in. They were constantly changing things around. A lot of subs to manage. Like it was very, everything was always in flux. So
Yeah,
yeah.
so tilt-ups are a great example of kind of
Yep.
this industrialized method of construction, right? It's you're kind of building out these modules, tilting them up, and then kind of building out the rest of the building to it. And that's kind of really uh, where we see as kind of what's traditional construction. You're kind of 0 to 1, pick a site, come up with a
Right.
design, right? Involve all the parties in the right sequence. To this new way of doing it, where it's much more, I guess, putting Legos together, right? Like you
Yeah.
have
Yeah. Yeah.
these pieces that you want to put in a building to meet some whatever performance or function, and you're really able to kind of play with these pieces and parts that are at a much higher level than kind of each of these phases of design.
That's sick. And like I think you explained it at one time to me as like you can even do things like where some things are made completely offset. They're completely prefab, but then like other times you could do a combination of like components that are prefab and then some on-site where you can do like a fully on-site construction. Like can you break down a little bit about like how you guys approach like what is the value of that for the builder? Like if they were to take one of those approaches or the other, what and like how is it that they're combining these things where they're basically saying, hey, we'll do some amount of this prefab and then we'll do some amount of this like on-site.
Yeah, so I think this is where construction's a little bit different than kind of traditional manufacturing, where you're really kind of building a product and then shipping that product somewhere.
Yep.
Construction is like you have to build the product where you need it to be.
Right.
You kind of have to assemble it there, but you also have to adhere to all the local jurisdictions and the local ways of which to kind of like bring that kind of building outcome about.
Right.
In some places, it might be cheaper and faster to kind of ship the component there and kind of fit it in, attach it. In some other jurisdictions, right, labor might be cheaper. It might be easier to just get a bunch of guys to kind of build a shed over whatever generator or something that you're covering.
Cool. And so, yeah, so the people you're working with are balancing these things, right? They're like looking
Mhm.
at how do they want to manage their projects? How do they want to be most cost effective? How can they find the materials they need, I would guess, too, and like how they're going to make those decisions based upon all of those things. And so, if you could talk a little bit about like, so there's Katalyst.di, it looks like you have a few products in there. Part of it is like project management. And
Mhm.
does that project management component, like maybe break down the product suite and like how those different products solve some of these problems?
Yeah, so we're still working through a lot of this, so
Yep.
definitely
Okay.
suggestions welcome as a kind of an early stage company looking for more feedback from everyone. But we largely break it down into kind of like three major categories. There's kind of the package organization at the library level, and we really see this as um, kind of program level agreement. Like, hey, these are the things that we want to put into projects to build. You can see this as kind of like the planning stage. The project is much more focused on, hey, like this is what we're deciding to build. This is where we're deciding to build it. How do we then go through the execution steps of is what we're planning appropriate for the locale? Who are we in partnership with to supply in that location, and making all those kind of final decisions and kind of tracking from manufacturer to site kind of within that project level. And then kind of the third bucket, which is something that we might involve kind of a lot of Foundry in, is kind of the analytics across both of these levels.
Right.
How are all of my projects performing? What are these critical packages that I need to pay extra attention to? Am I getting signals from my partners or my collaborators that are out of normal that I might need to take a second look at? So these are all things that we're kind of exploring at that third tier.
And so it's like the between the planning and the execution, there's all this data that's being generated, right? So like
Mhm.
there's and it's everything. It's like oh the actual work that's being done in the field, the actual people showing up, like things are and there's like probably some sort of level of disconnect between the state on the ground and the state in the system. But like maybe you could explain a little bit like what is the type of data that's generated where you're bringing Foundry to bear on these problems and like what are the challenges there that are kind of unique and if it involves anything to like the how the data can be out of sync with reality or any
Mhm.
of those things. So maybe unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a tough one, especially in construction. I think
Right.
one of the barrier problems is really there. A lot of this data exchange happens outside of digital
Yep.
context.
Yep.
It's like emails and phone calls, right? It's not very well
Yep.
organized. Sometimes it's like a weekly meeting where everyone kind of goes through a table. So this information can kind of come from anywhere. Part of the effort is kind of organizing this information in a place that's reusable, but also kind of give better mechanisms for this communication.
Right.
Maybe you're able to fill out the information once and it kind of federates to each of your partners that are requesting that information. So that's a lot of the, I guess, software workflows that we're exploring is how do I say, hey, put out a lead time update request. The
Right.
supplier gets the email of exactly kind of what the particular request is for. It kind of cuts out some of that, hey, like, what are you actually asking for? Those kinds of exchanges.
Nice. And so like to help so like if we take a step back to into the planning phase like to help try and hopefully make the project go as smooth as possible like one of the things you showed me is like you will model the components of a lot of these projects, right? And you'll
Mhm.
have like these digital models of everything from different bits of machinery that are going to be used and you'll like create a digital representation of that. And can you talk a little bit about that and how that process works and if you're bringing Foundry into that and how you'd be using it?
Yeah, so I think that's actually one of the reasons why early on we talk to Foundry is kind of like what we see as a divide kind of in our worlds,
Yeah.
so to speak. It's kind of like the geometric truth, right? This is kind of
Right.
like if you're familiar with CAD, kind of there, it's like lines on a page until you give them a meaning.
Yeah.
To kind of this building information modeling way of doing, where you're really executing design into what's essentially like a database that
Right.
has these transactional relationships that allow or disallow certain things, but it kind of keeps a data integrity of the whole. With what we see as kind of traditional tabular data, right? Your spreadsheets, time logs, bill of materials, and things like that. And really, how can you reconcile the two? How do you say, hey, this part of my design, this area of work is equivalent to all of these other things that are reporting aspects of that physical object.
Right.
I think that's where it's easy to say, hey, these things are Lego blocks and we have data on
Right.
these Lego
Right.
blocks, and we can tell you how you combine them or don't combine them. But like the actual implementation of it is quite sophisticated and quite difficult, kind
Yeah.
of leading through a bunch of different stages with a bunch of different people to really be able to deconstruct the total kind of construction process
Right.
into these kind of packages, work areas, these ways of
Let's try to go with an
building.
example here.
Right.
So like let's start simple with like a factory. And in my factory, I'm gonna have a boiler, right? And like
Mhm.
often you'll see boiler, the data the boiler generates is like these tabular data sets, these things you see after the fact, whether that's like the electricity usage or water or whatever, right? So there's this data stream the boiler creates, and like a lot of times they represent the boiler as the end result of that data that's generated by that boiler system, right? But like you guys are like actually trying to model the boiler, give it attributes, give it meaning, and like put that into a larger construction project as I understand it. But like try and stick, if we can try and unpack it a little bit, if you could give an example, like maybe in manufacturing or something more concrete as to how you approach this.
Um, yeah, I guess maybe a closer to home example, maybe a simpler example is like say like we're all working from home now, right?
Right. Right.
Um, right, everyone kind of needs a desk, a chair, a
Yep.
computer, these things like that. It all comes as a package. But if I'm shipping to you in America or shipping to someone in Europe, right, there might be complete different specifications, different vendors I can get them to, but ultimately
Right.
what I want is to send a desk package to you in the US and send a desk package to Europe.
Yep.
That's essentially kind of what we do at the forefront of that is organize that level of information. So I guess to your boiler example is even before the desk kind of gets to the room,
Yep.
it's already kind of pre-planned and pre-specified so that you're not kind of pulling all of
Nice.
this stuff together to build this kind of on-site.
And then do you maintain like some catalog of all of these various things, and you have a way to like rapidly kind of come in and assemble them?
Yeah, yeah. So say, my desk package in Europe is missing a chair.
Right.
The chair is extra long lead time, right? I can get a replacement, right? If I was ordering all the parts individually, I would have to do that for each individual case. So there
Yep.
is kind of a part of analysis where it's like, okay, maybe for the first 25, right? We are able to roll it out no problem, right? In the next 10, right, we have a delay on chairs. So we made a resolution of, hey, maybe we're pre-ordering chairs, stockpiling ourselves, and then
Right.
distributing it. And then for the next 100, we no longer had this problem. So
Nice.
those levels of decisions kind of on a lot more things and a
Nice.
lot more variables.
And are those going on throughout the life cycle of the whole project, or do you try to like front load those in the planning stage, and then when they're going to build and execution, there's less of that, or is it pretty much ongoing the whole project? You're dealing with those kind of issues.
To a varying degree at different scales. So
Yep.
there's a lot more impact you can make before anything hits the ground. But
Yeah.
once things do, right, there's
Right.
only certain wiggle room. So it does happen, but at kind of various levels. And I think part of what we're trying to track is the success of kind of this level of packaging, how certain things interact with each other, what delays might happen in the implementation on a project level, so that better feeds the planning information going to each project moving forward.
And how precise do you need to be? Like, what is can you have just like a good enough representation of the desk and chair? Or does it have to be like perfectly dial to like this person's use case?
So I think from a good enough standpoint, like
Yep.
very, very rough, right? It could just be a line on like a bill of materials sheet that kind of you can add on information to as
Okay.
a secondary, right? But to start with, you just kind of have to have the knowledge of what it takes to put together what you want to put together.
Okay. So yeah, you don't need to know every aspect, but enough to be meaningful, enough to have an impact and kind of like plan what you're going to actually do. So it's like a good enough
That's a
proxy.
lot of that's a lot of like the construction design process, right? Is kind
Right.
of pulling together architects, engineers, process experts, folks from kind of the operational team, the owner team
Yep.
that really understand what they need, how things need to be built to kind of bring that information together.
Do you ever find like best practice emerging? Because like in software engineering, we get a lot of best practice that emerges across working groups who work together a lot or work in specific domains. You'll often see like common system design elements, and they emerge and then become standardized, and they'll become part of a design pattern, and then like kind of everyone sort of builds the stuff the same way. Does that happen in construction, or like is it way more custom than that?
So it does to a degree. I think
Yeah.
construction, in a way, like people take pride in a level of uniqueness of their
Right. Right.
projects, even though there's a lot to be gained from kind of this level of standardization. I
Yeah.
think we're starting to kind of break down that wall. I think
Right.
one of the big pressures of just having to build so much is one of the key drivers. And I think, it's a part of this industrialized construction future that we kind of imagine that's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years.
Do you see that happening though, like where people get more and more standardized, or do you think it'll always be like this resistance to too much standardization, or like how do you see that happening?
Um, so I think, ultimately when you build something, like the end user of that space or
Yep.
function is what drives more to be built. And
Right.
I think even though we don't like it, right, if you look at cookie cutter like housing plots that are
Right.
built by
Right.
these large construction companies, like, yeah, we all look at it and say like, hey, like cookie cutter housing is not great, but there's a huge demand for it. It solves a huge problem.
Right.
It's at a price point that fits the market. So I think it's not really how I see it. It's really how the end consumers are going to kind of vote with their dollars, I
Do
guess.
you think there's a role in there for you guys to play in helping solve things like the national housing crisis, where you can help speed up construction, you can help these people operate more efficiently, bring down cost? Like, is that part of what's driving what you guys do?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think it's a problem that we see as universal. I think
Yep.
right now we're just trying to be very narrow in uh where we approach, because construction is just so
Huge.
wide,
Yeah.
but there is like enormous applicability. I think hospitals are a
Yep.
big one.
Yep.
Kind of disaster relief is another big one.
Absolutely. Yeah. Emergency
um
housing.
yeah, and
Yep.
even
Yep.
a
Yep.
lot of just like infrastructural and uh kind of facilities work, right? There's a lot of
Yep.
those that could benefit from this
That's
approach
really
quite
interesting, even
quickly.
thinking about like emergency construction for when you think about the pandemic, right? And like think
Mhm.
about like where do emergency hospitals need to be built? And how do we get the materials there? And like how do we put those together and assemble those quickly? And I know there's a lot
Yeah,
of
it's the same
yeah,
like desk packaging problem,
yeah,
but
yeah,
whatever
exactly.
you can get within like a 100-mile radius.
Exactly. All right, I'm starting to get it more. I'm starting to kind of understand more. All right, so like looking into this more, like if we look at the role Foundry is playing, where's
Mhm.
Foundry most focused? Is it in the planning stage, or is it focused more in the project execution stage and monitoring all that data that's coming out of the construction project?
Um, so I think it has a role to play in both. I think we
Okay.
look at it much more like as like, I guess, functional domains.
Okay.
I think one is kind of data onboarding. So at whichever stage we're getting our sort of data set that we're working with the customer on, onboarding that data set to our platform, or kind of like leveraging Foundry to clean or kind of join some of that data together in a much more usable form. So kind of
Got it.
data
Got
in.
it.
The second kind of like functional domain is kind of data synchronization. So
Okay.
a lot of our customers use platforms to do things like construction administration, purchase order tracking, invoicing, things like that, that might have information that they're managing in a platform that they want to continue using or they enjoy using, that they just want a piece of data sync back and forth, right? So
Okay.
that's what we use Foundry to build some, uh, in a way, very custom pipelines to do data exchange in that way. And kind of the third major way we use it is kind of that aggregate data analysis, kind of within a company's data bubble, helping them understand their kind of their data stored within our system or combined with data that they're storing in their systems, kind of what investigative prerogative they might
Right.
have.
Right.
But also on our end, kind of aggregate analysis on like platform performance, how we're doing with our
Right.
company internally, and a lot of kind of those internal tool building that really help us understand how we're doing.
So in that aggregate analysis piece is a lot of looking for signals, like whether they're signals of project health or not project health, like you're not healthy, like in anomalies, things like that. Is that what you're mainly doing in that aggregate portion?
Yeah, I think it's one of these things where we're faced this problem where like in construction, folks don't really love sharing. So it's kind of
Yeah.
this thing where like how can you share a market signal in a way that doesn't reveal any specifics?
Yeah.
And kind of that aggregate level ranging in a way is a way for us to do that, is kind of like, hey, like if you're getting a signal that's so out of boundary with what
Right.
everyone else is getting, at the minimum that warrants a second check.
Right. Anomaly detection and alerting, kind of a workflow where you're getting them there. Um, so like to recap, then it's like the data ingestion. You're trying to get all the data sources together. You're also trying to synchronize data as it's changing, I guess, between those things, and then the aggregation and analysis phase. So it's kind of like those three areas where Foundry is really being brought to bear. On the data ingestion phase, like what type of data sources do you deal with? Like, is it a lot of spreadsheets? Is it, RDS? Is it like, what is it that you're dealing with?
So a lot of spreadsheets,
Yeah.
where we're looking for the first one who's like, hey, we got this all organized in this one thing. It would be great if you could just map it.
Right.
But
Right.
I think really like a lot of what we build is competing with spreadsheets and manpower. So
It's so funny because there's that old saying that all data winds up in Excel. Like in data engineering saying all data winds up in
yeah.
Excel. I mean, dude, I've seen so many customers who are using Foundry, not so
Mhm.
many, but a few, and a lot of it is data exchange as a CSV file. That's like the number one thing I keep seeing over and over again, right? So
Yeah,
it's
why fight it, right? You could just
yeah,
make it a lot
there's the
easier, a lot less prone to error, right? Like
yeah.
just make the experience better for people.
Yeah, Foundry is great at processing CSV. I haven't played around with any of the Excel integrations yet. Like I know that they can output some Excel files. I don't know about input. I've always taken like just had CSV files as the input or JSON files. It's just easier working in CSV files than it is with JSON. But like, do you get JSON too, or do you just typically get CSV and Excel and that's it?
Mostly just CSV and Excel. I think a lot of what we
Yep.
look for is like, what are you going to do with the data that we kind of aggregate and output, right? Like,
Okay.
do we need to put in a structure for you to push into a different system?
Yep.
If so, what does that look like? Are you using it to do a piece of analysis? Are you joining with other data sets? How can we just make sure that what we output to you is kind of immediately usable? And I think Foundry does allow us to kind of do that work within each company's data domain that kind of keeps it one, both flexible, but two, kind of secure within their data space.
Do you ever have to do data enrichment when you're bringing that in with like third-party data sets, maybe data sets you've purchased in the commercial space or zip code databases or anything else like that? Are you doing any kind of like data enrichment through those pipelines?
Yeah, so that's I think something that we're coming up against. We have a lot of wild ideas of how we can do
Right,
this, but really it kind of takes that base layer of like, hey, we need that structured way to break down construction in order to meet this data set wherever it may be, right? It might be kind of a raw materials data set, it
right,
might be, an embodied carbon data set, but really we're now at that point where if you kind of go through this breakdown process, if you meet your construction components at this endpoint where there's another piece of data attached, we can then leverage a structure to bring that analysis forward so you get
right.
kind of a total number.
And like as you guys are working on these pipelines, like what tools are you typically using in Foundry? Are you using the code repositories? Are you using pipeline builder? Like how are you building your data pipelines?
So a little bit of everything. I
Okay.
think our data team leverages a lot of code notebooks, so it's really
Yeah.
fun kind of getting in there trying to figure out what's going on. But I think one thing we're trying to do is like leverage the out of the box tools a lot more, especially for some of the kind of simpler
Yep.
things,
Yep.
like cleanup pipelines and was it Contour? Yeah.
Contour is really good for analysis of the data sets once you
Mhm.
got like the pipeline out the other end. Typically, I like to use Contour before I make an ontology because like what I typically find is I get this data set and I think it's cool. Like I think, oh yeah, this is perfect. My ontology can be awesome. And then I go
Mhm.
make the ontology and I immediately like realize I dropped 50 other things that I needed and I forgot about them. And so like going into Contour to analyze my data set, it's a little easier to see like the type of analysis I want to do. I didn't actually fully solve the problem. I need to go get some more data, or I need to like change the way this data is structured in order to analyze it in the way I want to. So and it's just good at exploring those data sets before I jump to go ahead and model that in an ontology. So that's how I've been primarily using Contour. But like I know people that are doing nothing but Contour, like this guy Kai, or nothing but Contour. He's more like into using data sets. He hasn't done it. He's like maybe doesn't like some of the he advocates in some workflows for just using Contour on top of data sets as opposed to going straight to ontologies and building in like Quiver and Workshop. So and he's got a whole methodology around that. I'm gonna have him on the channel. Like I want to get into it with him about like how does he see building and
Yeah.
Contour and data sets versus the ontology system. And he's been using Foundry for a really long time, so he has like some really good insights there as to why he prefers that workflow. But yeah, I mean, it's just the ontology could add like another layer of complexity until you're really sure that you've got the model right. If you bolt it on and then you kind of got it wrong, it's like all the downstream stuff falls apart. And then so all that investment in like the workshop app and the quiver analysis and all this other stuff, it becomes problematic. It starts to break down and not deliver value. So you want to know you got the model right. Speaking of which, as you guys are building these, are you finding like ontologies that could actually be reusable, like or models, even if you're not doing an ontology, like say you're building these pipelines and you're creating these data sets. Do you think you're finding a way to like model these things in a consistent way virtually that points the way towards a more like Lego block way of building? Or like what are you guys finding as you model this stuff?
I think we're starting to, but I think ultimately that's the ambition. I think that's the way that we've kind of set things up to allow each of the kind of company ontologies we set up for customers
Right.
to exist within their own space, but then be able to find those commonalities aggregated together. So we're still kind of at that lower phase where we're kind of mapping out the data sets at the company level.
Right.
But right, we're hoping to get there sooner
It'd
rather
be
than
pretty
later.
amazing to see what comes out of that because if you really think about it, the virtual space is a great way to iterate on that problem. And like, it's really cool if you could actually come up with a model that actually at least 80% solves the problem for everyone, because then that
Mhm.
approximation of like what this thing should look like that's good enough for the estimation is like, well, we kind of figure that out after looking at everyone else's models, and figuring out that, oh, this ontological model is good enough for 95% of the industry at an 80%, 70% accuracy, like whatever you need it to be. And that could just become a standard catalog, like
Mhm.
that would be pretty incredible. And like with Foundry too, like because you could share those ontologies, like getting into that. So you have a really unique data synchronization problem, which we're going to talk about in 1 second. But like uh, before we jump into the data synchronization, you could also like do ontology sharing. Like figuring out like, oh, if these customers ever adopt Foundry themselves, we could all speak about these ontology objects kind of the same way. So it's like their spreadsheet, representation of a boiler wouldn't have to be the spreadsheet representation of a boiler anymore. Could actually be the ontology object you created. If they start like actually building more in Foundry. Do you ever see that future materializing, or what do you think?
I think it kind of like always is one of these things where it begs the question is like why would me as someone who maybe potentially doesn't isn't that well versed with technology go through this process of doing this thing.
Right, right,
And I think it's always like what is the value to be gained at the end of the journey that really
right.
makes it worth it to kind of keep going down that path. And um I think for where we're at, getting that data enrichment and getting that higher level information and kind of like understanding and control is what potentially is at the end of that rainbow. So
Right.
trying to pull all of that together is what will kind of drive that initial energy to say like, hey, this is a worthwhile kind of practice or framework for you to adopt, because at the end of this framework, there is all of these benefits to be gained as you're managing your programs, as you're managing your projects in this way.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. Like, it does take a lot of work to convince people to maybe change how they work, right? So it's like
Yeah.
that people management, change management side of it. And I have to imagine that in this business, things are moving fast. So like, what is the likelihood someone could slow down to learn something else or insert a new tool? It's probably not like, oh, like I'm gonna drop Excel and insert Foundry, right? But like that seems like time consuming. There's probably to like someone that I don't know if that's correct or not, but sure seems like they'd be resistant to something like that if they have to constantly be moving on this project. Like there is no downtime, you know.
Oh
So
yeah, people are very resistant to change,
yeah,
and I think that's a big part of like us like not really being kind of like a just a software approach. Like we
yeah,
have like a services arm, right? We do kind of a full solutions that really helps people in a way like move towards this process, even if they're crazy slammed in the middle of the project trying
right,
to get things done, because like we feel and we know that they have the pressure on the other side, right? Where
right, right,
if you
right.
do build it the traditional way, you're really at a high risk of just not meeting project performance to begin
Yeah,
with. So you're in between a rock and a hard place. And
yeah.
we're really here to try to help you out and not force you to learn a new tool to then potentially get the benefits, right?
That echoes across a lot of industries too. I see that same need. I also think that's why Palantir themselves have had so many engagements with forward deployed engineers. Is just that the same problems. It's like how do you get people to get a better outcome with this tool? That's not something you just make that you can just hand them and expect them to figure it out, or and you have to actually figure out where the value being delivered is and bring them along on that journey. So it's like you can't just expect people to stop the way they're working immediately and just transfer over this new thing. You got to like provide a bridge. You got to build the bridge. Uh, okay. One of the things when I met you, just a little background. I met Libo at FoundryCon, and one of the talks we were in was the Apollo talk, right? And you had mentioned you have a really unique data synchronization problem where like you don't always have internet connectivity. And I was wondering if you could like break down that problem and like sort of how you guys have solved it, because I thought that was really cool.
Okay, so one of our future problems, not quite a problem for us today, but it's one of these things where it's kind of about connecting data from the back office to the folks on the site. And a lot of times on site, the internet connectivity is quite uh, low bandwidth, to say the least. Sometimes if you're building out in really remote locations, not really that reliable to uh, pull a lot of this large data set. So one of the things that we had considered is how can we, portion parts of the platform that services kind of this data set into maybe like a mobile data center that can then arrive on site, drive back sync on like a weekly basis back to main base, but really make that information availability that much tighter to the folks who are building the thing.
That's really cool. Yeah, and like a lot of people don't even realize like there are environments where bandwidth is limited. Like it's
Yeah.
really hard to ship big. It's hard to transfer large amounts of data. It's hard to ship updates, and like it's just very interesting to see that. And like there's even that parallel too. Like if you're building software packages, you need to ship updates to the software packages. Sometimes the data needs to go in conjunction with the update. So there's just like a lot of interesting use cases that start to come out when you're talking about remote real world environments where like things are happening. You have to be there, and there's not necessarily fiber laid to the job site that day. So I thought that was really interesting. And like you guys saw a potential use case too, I think, for Apollo when thinking about how you might install updates too, right? Was that something you guys were considering as part of that future kind of model?
Yeah, so I think we get asked a lot, even though it's one of those things where unless I think we have to support it, we're going to try to not. But it's kind of supporting on-prem and kind of multi-cloud deployments. Like it's especially with, data centers, it's something that folks like to ask about,
Right.
especially since we're currently on AWS. But I think when it comes to that and we do have to do it, it would be one of those things that could be hugely beneficial for
Yeah,
us to look at.
definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. That's really cool. Cool. And so, like, in other categories of data synchronization that you're dealing with, like, what about like, are there issues where the data is stale? Like, are you getting into places where like real world has progressed to stage 5 and our data set reflects stage 3 or something? Or like what are some of the challenges you face in there? And like, do you have stale data problems? Like, what are the issues you face?
I think stale data problem is like probably one of the biggest chunks of the pie of
Yeah.
like this whole construction data synchronization problem.
Yeah.
There's just so many people involved, so many people talking to so many different people, that, in a way, like there is, you might not even know how stale the data is.
That's funny because no one bothered to tell anyone or write it down.
Or it's in the wrong
Yeah.
place, right? It didn't make it
Yeah.
back to the spreadsheet that everyone's now checking.
Oh yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, the secret report. No, no, that's not the right report. I got the secret report over here. That's got the actual numbers.
The sticky got cleaned up from someone's desk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good. The sticky note. That's funny. Cool. So like on the so if we go past that and now into like this, we kind of covered the data synchronization, ingestion, all that kind of stuff. But if you get into so this is where it's interesting is you get into the aggregation and analysis. And we touched a little bit on it earlier about like anomaly detection, alerting, and we had a previous conversation where like we talked a little bit about how anomaly detection and alerting could be like a really powerful use case because it can sort of empower people who are going to stay within their existing workflows. They may not want to adapt, but you can augment them and make them better through this like anomaly, just surfacing the signal data in the noise. And that was something you thought I think was pretty cool. But if you can talk a little bit about anything like that you're doing now and how Foundry it could work in that scenario and where it could maybe be super beneficial or anything like that.
Yeah, so I think right now we're looking to kind of facilitate a lot of that update communication through email.
Okay.
But there is a world where those notifications could be sent like by text, right?
Right. Right.
So one of the ways that Foundry could help us kind of, especially early on, kind of prototype a lot of these alerts, especially if very closely tied to a workflow we're helping to implement with a particular company, is send out these summaries or status alerts to a set of users at a particular cadence or on demand using kind of actions, things like that.
And like, what do you think about like a purpose built? So one of the things we talked about too is like if you build like a native app, like a mobile app or a native mobile app that is just
Mhm.
dead simple and it's just the alerting stream, right? And they can like maybe take an action, like oh I read
Mhm.
it, confirmed or whatever, acknowledged, like just to write back that the
Yeah.
alert was received and it's acknowledged and we're doing something. Do you think there's a case in there to be made for combining Foundry with native mobile applications or custom applications that may have not been produced in Foundry? Maybe there's something you build custom on your own as part of like a mobile development initiative, but you're doing that because you want like a native experience, so like you're building a native iOS or Android app. Do you guys see any kind of potential for that? Or
Yeah, I think actually that's a big part of like what we're doing. Like I
yeah.
think we use Foundry as like more of a backend tool. It's
Yep.
kind of mixed in with kind of our backend services. We have like an API gateway that our web app is built against.
Nice.
As we build kind of mobile apps, it'll be kind of against the same gateway. It'll access kind of different parts of data sets or analytics that we produce in Foundry. I think in terms of that native experience, like I think exactly like what you're saying.
Right.
We're looking at maybe like the app itself might not even be the step that we need to take, right? Maybe an earlier step could just be texting.
Yeah.
If you can
Yeah.
do texting really well, right, it works with voice to text, a lot of things that people use already. Maybe we can deliver information or collect responses that way.
Yeah.
From an application standpoint, things like QR codes, right? If you scan it, maybe we just do it from a browser window, right? Maybe we don't make you download an app. So that way,
Right.
a lot more people can do it. We can get a lot more signals. It becomes much more low friction. So,
That's really cool. Yeah, a lot of people don't realize like Foundry's got a whole microservice architecture behind it. You can like integrate applications into that microservice mesh, and that's how a lot of people are using Foundry. Like when they're building custom front ends. I know that like my work, if we were to acquire it, it would totally be under that scenario, which is like we would actually probably have Foundry in the back end processing data in batch. We probably wouldn't even have it connected in a lot of cases to the front end experience through the API layer. But like people forget that's like it has its own app layer. That's true, but like you could build custom apps on top of it using all of the APIs. Have you ever found any like gotchas when you were building on the APIs that bummed you out? Like one of the things that that is always hard in apps is just authorization. Like, how do I log into this freaking app? You know, it's like, did you ever have any hiccups like authorization, or did you have any kind of issues where you felt like, oh man, this could be easier, like if they just change this in the API to be able to do these kind of things?
I think our data team might have a better answer for
All
you
right,
on that question. I'll
all right,
definitely defer to them on that. But I think, yeah, I guess from my viewpoint, so far so good.
nice,
It
nice.
didn't seem like there were critical issues that were kind of like unhandled. I think
Okay,
maybe one of the things was like IP whitelisting.
right, yeah,
Um,
yeah, that's always a pain in the ass.
that takes a little
Yeah.
bit of a roundabout way to get it done. But it seems like that's something that is being worked on. So,
Yeah, for
um,
people who don't know, like in Foundry, you typically have to whitelist every data source that you want to connect to. So it's like you can't just like it's not just open to the internet. You know, it's like you're not going to connect right away. So often that's kind of painful. Like what about other things? So like, what would you say Foundry has been like the most like impressed you the most at when you've been building?
um, I guess it's like mostly like how everything's in one place. It
Right.
makes it easy to direct people to different areas. It makes it really easy to um, like onboard someone maybe at a particular intersection, but really allow them to kind of go horizontally towards both end of that kind of data pipeline.
Yeah.
Um, One thing that we hope to do a lot more is kind of build internal ontology kind of like data marts so that folks with maybe like less of kind of that data analytics or like engineering skill can really just move things around and kind of look at investigations that they might want to perform themselves. Right?
Yeah, yeah, leveraging. I mean, it comes with that ontology explorer, but you have to do the
Mhm.
work and actually build all the ontology objects. So you got to have all those in there, and they have to be referenceable, and they need to be maintained, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean it's a tough problem, right? Like you have to organize it, and then
Yeah,
you have to make it like really easy to use for kind of folks on the other end. So
that's
that's
probably
kind
the
of
most
a
important part. Like a lot of people don't realize it, but like getting the ontological model right is like that's almost. I would say it's like 70% of the battle. You get the ontological model right, shit's gonna hum. Like everything's gonna be amazing. But if you get it wrong, like nothing's gonna work. So it's like that's what I've found anyway. Is like you really have to you have to do the hard work and figure out like what are the relationships between these things. How do I make it reflect reality? Because making it reflect reality is like that's where the business value is. Because what I
Mhm,
found is like when I want to build a new app, the to the extent that I've effectively modeled reality of my business in the ontology, I don't need to recreate it. Like I don't need to make a new ontology object. I already know what my business looks like, you know, and then I can take that data and apply it in innumerable ways to like solve real problems in my business. But a lot of people, it's definitely it's super easy to get an ontology out the door because you can just like straight from your data pipeline data sets, you can create the objects, and then you're not even thinking about like, did I
yeah.
do it right? Did I do it wrong? You've now got these apps that people are depending on downstream that are built on those things. So it's easy to get wrong, I think, at the end of the day. But yeah, I agree. Like getting that ontology system and actively using it, getting all those people like actively using your ontology is huge. So yeah, like I think that's totally right. I also think there's a lot of potential for people like you. I keep saying it is like to have that de facto standard of what an ontology object looks like in this domain for this type of business. And if businesses could standardize on that, that would be huge. It's kind of like, I don't know if you ever heard of the semantic web and what is the people, Open Schema or schema.org. I don't know if
Mhm,
you've ever heard of them.
yeah, yeah.
But like that whole idea that you could represent things universally under like a common data catalog is super powerful, you know.
Mhm.
So it would be cool to see one day, you know.
Yeah, I mean there are some standards out there like I think industrial foundation classes that like are
Yep.
attempts at doing this. Like our head of engineering gets really excited about all of this standardized
Yeah.
protocol talk.
The
I think it's one of these things where like it would be really great. It's kind of a ideal future scenario. But the
Right.
realities that we're faced are like quite far from what that could look like. So
Right.
it's kind of this thing where like we just have to keep chugging at it, and keep pushing and move the needle in that direction.
Nice. So what about Foundry? So like if we do, okay, we talked Foundry positives. What are the Foundry negatives? Are there negatives that you've experienced with it? And like, if like whether that's customer interaction or problems you had internally with the engineering side, like what are the
Mhm.
negatives you've experienced?
I think it's like there's a few layers of things you have to learn,
Yeah.
or you have to kind of like internalize for Foundry to kind of make sense. And
Right.
a lot of times it feels like just like smashing my face against the wall until like something happens the right way, where like
Yeah.
everything kind of makes sense. The overlapping features, I think, in a lot of the tools doesn't help.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but I think um, as we build kind of iteratively, like chaining the tools together, understanding how they work together, like the picture becomes a lot clearer. But kind of having that map maybe at the beginning would be really helpful.
Like
Um,
a mental map of Foundry, so you know how to navigate.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, like how might I use these two or three things together? Kind of like the AWS kind of like reference architecture
Right. Right.
things.
Right. Exactly.
Like yeah, if you want to build this is generally what it would look like,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. That's
I
a really
think
good point, that reference architecture piece, because like even in people who build tooling for developers, like I've worked a lot with the people at the serverless cloud, and they have a
mhm,
whole a whole set of tools that people use AWS Lambda to like build on, and some of their other serverless tools. But like when they initially launched, I was like, hey, Austin, you guys need like a set of reference architectures that are just in the command line tool. You know, it's like I want to do data streaming with Kinesis and time series, and like just pull me the reference architecture for that, because there's a lot of different ways people can put those
mhm.
tools together, and they usually miscombine them. They don't combine them correctly because they don't have the right mental model of how all those things should be combined and like what that system actually looks like. So the equivalent for Foundry would be kind of cool, like I have this reference of this thing I want to build. What's the right way to build it?
Yeah,
So
and
that is
I think a lot of it's just like I think the documentation makes an attempt at a very high level, but
right.
it's like the mid level that's really missing. It's like how do I
Yeah.
take these really
Yeah.
great ideas in this like great overall framework and apply them at then like the documentation level where you're like
Right.
telling me about these specific things, like how do they relate to each other?
Well, this is why I keep arguing with them about you need developer free and open access for developers, because the people who create those reference architectures for AWS are not necessarily AWS a lot of the time. It's a lot of individual contributors out there in the software space who figure it out. And then there's also like the third parties, like the serverless framework, for example, which is just one example of gazillions, where there are open source tools created by people that take all of that industry knowledge and they turn it into a developer experience that can be leveraged effectively. So it's like
Mm,
Palantir, I think, could take that at a high level, do pretty well with it, like AWS does. But then when it comes down to specific industries, specific use cases, like often it's better to scale that out through developers and let them like figure out those solutions. And Palantir, like with Palantir, you could absolutely build like you could build a CLI tool custom as a developer that interacts with the Foundry APIs to do just that. You could say like, build me a reference architecture data pipeline for this financial type of data, and like you could build a whole reference architecture that way. There also talks about they're going to have natural language support here soon, which is kind of interesting. So it's like you could actually like build pipelines from natural language and sample data. So that'll actually be kind of crazy, because maybe
oh, that'll be
maybe
fun.
that maybe the reference architecture gets codified into that, which would be
Hmm.
crazy, dude. Like that's the kind of stuff I can't wait to see. And like they did experiment a little bit too with archetypes. Did they ever try and show you any existing archetypes that could help you, where they have these like pre-made solutions or
Yeah, I think maybe that's like where the reference architecture
yeah.
is starting to happen. But
Yeah.
I guess like we didn't find anything that's like directly something we can use to. I guess maybe it's just a variety of problems that it covers hasn't intersected with our problem space yet.
For people who don't know what an archetype is, it's basically Foundry has this thing called templates. Templates can roll up an entire project, which includes like your data pipelines, your data sets, your ontology objects, your applications you've built on the ontology, and you can like share that between different Foundry instances, and you just install it, right? So you can export a template, you can install a template, And all you got to do is like hook up the underlying data sources, and then it'll just build out this whole project straight from that. And Palantir is typically called those archetypes, and a good example would be like HyperAuto is like an archetype for Foundry, and it does like supply chain management in the automotive space, right? And so that's a super powerful use case. They even include like software-defined data integrations in that archetype. So, but do you ever see like the potential, like where you would have like the Foundry equivalent for your space? Like you have the archetype for what you do, and that becomes what you sell.
Um, I guess in a way, like maybe not like the template is what we sell. Like
Yeah,
that template is something that I think, for us, we'd hope to just have folks be able to learn and adopt as like, something that's valuable to them as a best practice. If they want to uh break it apart or combine it with other things, really, really up to them. I think one of the things we are looking for is um the ability to kind of like cast these relationships onto any of these kind of like project data sets a lot more easier. So if people kind of inherent elements of the structure that we built or the structure that we put out, those are all kind of artifacts that we can pick up as we investigate this data.
got it. So it's like more like pick and choose, like pick the pieces of the system that you like, and not necessarily take like the whole this gigantic
Mm-hmm.
giant thing that is like all encompassing, all intrusive, invasive, gonna change every way you work, sort of a thing. That makes sense. Cool. So like but as far as where do you see over the next 5 years, like on the technology roadmap, like where do you see yourself getting with Foundry? Like do you feel like you're fully like we've got the use case we need, this is all good, we're pretty much just going to continue working with the way you're working, or like do you have an idea of where you want to be with like leveraging Foundry and take the industry like in 5 years? Like where do you see it going?
Um, so I think we're pretty early on that ladder. I think there's a lot of stuff we really want to get to, really want to do. I think the ambitions are high in what kind of modeling can do for us ultimately when we do get uh, that level of data set and that level of kind of structure into these projects, whether that's through our platform or through other means. Um, I guess on top of that, being able to do that across a wide set of active and non-active projects gives us a lot of learnings upon which we can really influence kind of the next generation of projects. And I think those things we want to say we can do very quickly, but I think ultimately working with kind of the early innovators in our industry, like it's going to take a lot of hard work and a lot of collaboration to get there. So.
Are you gonna make a Foundry university for Katalyst.di where they can like learn, develop the mental map and learn how to use Foundry? What do you think?
Yeah,
Good idea.
actually, our data team does a really great job of like maintaining a like a little corner of our Confluence universe where they
Nice.
have like help documentation, how they actually go to implement a lot of these solutions, what are the security patterns to kind of keep all the data safe, what are all the things that they're using to build certain things. So yeah, we're very much kind of trying to make it easier for more people to
I
onboard
just feel like
themselves.
the
Yeah.
the builders cohorts are lucky because they can create a lot of that, and it's going to be really valuable one day when I believe there will be like an open source community, a thriving like developer community. A lot of that's going to be super valuable information. If, like when it becomes valuable when other people can start like experimenting with Foundry, who maybe aren't necessarily customers, but there's like developers trying to learn it. So I think you guys are like, it's sort of like you're building that best practice for the startup community, that is like looking at this, which is just different. It's probably fundamentally a little different than the enterprise community. Like the startup space is different. We're always trying to move fast. We're
Mhm.
always trying to like try new things and iterate. It's definitely a little bit different than the enterprise space. But I think it's kind of neat too. Like Palantir brings you two together, right? So like they bring that enterprise customer base along with this startup space, and you guys get to like interact. I've heard you've been to some meetups, and like people will be there that are both like in the Foundry for builders cohort, but then you have like the enterprise customers, and that's kind of an interesting dynamic. But do you see anything like kind of cool playing out there with the dynamic between the enterprise customers and the builders customers?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think that's
Yep.
something that we're kind of looking forward to as well. I think
Yep.
The companies that, especially within our space, that are not only looking at Foundry, potentially using Foundry, in a way we feel like are definitely within a similar mindset that we have when we look at kind of construction data. I think it's one of these things also is like the level of engagement and kind of like the customer journey on the enterprise and the startup level are so different, that it's kind of hard to meet in the middle sometimes. So I think that's something that could probably use some gap closing as well.
Right, right,
Yeah.
totally. You guys will stay up all night drinking beer talking about cool things you want to build. I think at the enterprise level, sometimes people are a little more chill and like they're not as ready to like change the world probably as a lot of startups are and stuff. But I think it's a cool dynamic, man. And
Yeah, and I
really,
think,
yeah,
especially us as like we're at least in like, I guess we're in construction, which is like a lower sophistication field, I guess. Like some of the startups that are much more, I think, technology oriented, they move a
yeah,
lot faster.
yeah.
So I think for us it's been a good like learning experience, especially
That's awesome.
kind of using the tools and being able to do a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, I think there's a really neat. I think there's a lot of things you're going to learn too about just change management and people problems. Like you can teach a lot of those startups a lot about that too. And like, but like that's I often find that like when you're scaling too, like as a company, you do run like change management becomes more important. You know, the people problems become the more important problems that often you have to solve. Not everything is a technical challenge. But like a lot of the things as you scale are not technical challenges, right? So it's just like I think that's really cool, and the ability to share all of that knowledge, not just like the technical insights, Foundry, whatever. But anyway, epic interview, man. I don't want to keep you any longer. I know we're a little over time already, so but thank you so much for the time. It's totally awesome. But before I jet, is there anything you want to say before we close out? Like, do you want to give any shout outs to anyone or have people check out your site and like where can they find you?
Yeah, check us out at Katalystdi.com. It's Catalyst with a K. I guess
I'll leave links in the description too.
yeah,
Yep.
so check out the links in the description. I think if anyone is, in construction or, you're, working at a company that maybe is looking to do a lot of construction, or you're having kind of a lot of issues, or this way of building sounds really interesting to you and you want to find out more, feel free to, I guess, reach out to me over email. I'm just Libo at Katalyst.di.com, or visit our website, use our text bot there. A lot of our folks will be on the other side, looking to help and answer any questions that you might have. So.
Awesome, man. Sweet. Thank you, Libo. I appreciate it, man. I'm just gonna hit
I
end record
appreciate
here real
you.
quick, and there we go. Ending.